Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. As we continue to confront the coronavirus pandemic, our first priority, of course, is staying healthy, keeping our families well and safe, and thinking about and praying for the people who are in the hospital and sick, and all the folks who are caring for those people in hospitals across the country. But there are also other ways in which we may be feeling insecure today and in our most basic needs. And one of those basic needs, of course, is food and feeding our families. My guest on today's episode is Laurie Ristino. She is has been in the federal government, in the FDA and Health and Human Services for 20 years, involved in policy regarding food, agriculture, the Farm Bill, and environmental and climate change issues as well, and how all of these intersect. She lives in Vermont and continues to write and consult on these issues. And we have really, I feel like a broken record sometimes when I say a fascinating conversation. It's an important conversation about food security. Everything from how school children are getting access to meals they desperately need while schools are closed during the pandemic, all the way up to how the United States is going to need to interact with the rest of the world on climate change, on environmental issues, and how those affect food, how we get access to food, and how we can best assure that we have good quality food for our families going forward. I know you're going to learn so much and still have a lot of questions as I do, but there's so much to read and watch and learn about this really important issue. This is a good place to start. My conversation with Laurie Ristino on food security. Please stay tuned and enjoy. In this time of pandemic, the coronavirus sweeping the country and the world, many of us feel a great sense of insecurity. Will we get access to the healthcare we need if we get sick or one of our loved ones gets sick? And a related topic that is not distantly but very closely related is the issue of food. We know that we're worried about will we have enough food during this crisis, as many of us, and hopefully the rest of us soon, sheltering at home to wait out the worst of this. My guest today is an expert in food security, Laurie Ristino. First of all, Laurie, thank you so much for being on the podcast and being with me to talk about this really important issue.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you have had a long career in government on this issue, and also a career as a lawyer and a law professor. Give us a little bit of background on yourself and maybe help our audience understand how the issue of food insecurity becomes so important at a time like this. Not that it wasn't important before, because it was, but why it becomes especially important for us to think about at a time like this.
Sure, absolutely. So you're right. I was a federal attorney for a couple of decades, and I worked at the USDA. I actually come to food security from an environmental standpoint, although over the years it's taken on more of a humanitarian aspect as well. So I have a deep bench kind of in conservation and the environment and the intersection between how we produce food and how we use our natural resources to do so. And with climate change, this is becoming a particularly important issue globally. And I can talk about that a little bit more. And after I was practicing law with the federal government for a couple of decades, I left to start a Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Vermont Law School, where I was also an associate professor. And I left there. I'm consulting now as well as a lecturer at Johns Hopkins, where I teach environmental policy. I've also been a visiting scholar at GW Law, where I was focusing on really the intersection of agriculture and the environment and climate change. How do we address these really complex policy issues, policy and law issues. So that is kind of my thumbnail of my background.
Mm-hmm. And
And
that's a lot. I mean, there's a lot that covers that. So, and that's great because I mean, I'm very interested in all of the aspects of that issue. How, how maybe start? We could start with what is food security, or its flip side, food insecurity, and how does that become even more especially critical and urgent at a time like this? Would you say?
sure. Yeah, and it is. And in fact, as you said in your opening comments, I think sometimes people would think of something like the Farm Bill or wonky policy matters and not think or not see the relevance to what's going on right now with the coronavirus. But I think it is incredibly relevant because those policies touch every aspect of our lives and really not only the ability to eat currently, but also into the future, which is really important. So I see this as an opportunity to look at these policies that are so vital for our future, and really how we model to good policy and law for the world. So food security it's really evolved over the decades. I tend to use the definition that comes out of the United Nations, and I'm probably not going to give an accurate definition. I don't have it right in front of me right now, but it's generally enough nutritional food to lead a healthy life that is also culturally appropriate. Um, and I like the definition because it gives you some clues as to what kind of policy you need to put into place to really achieve that. And we haven't in this country, the wealthiest country in the world, we haven't achieved that. So it is aspirational, but I believe it is, and it must be attainable because it is so important. The ability to eat good food, to have a full life, a full and healthy life, I think it's a basic human need, and we're really seeing the fault lines really in our society when it comes to folks who are not able right now to get enough good food to eat.
Mm-hmm.
They might be okay during normal times, but because of we have record now unemployment. We were just talking about this previously.
Yeah.
Unemployment claims right now. So people who were doing okay, but they might live on the margin, or they didn't live on the margin, but now they've lost their job, and they are now in this sector, a larger, growing sector of our population, that there's a real concern whether those individuals and their families will have enough nutritious food to eat.
Yeah. Well, let me maybe start with this issue because there's so many different directions we could go in
Mm-hmm.
here, and that's okay. But just because it was something I was reading this morning, um, and something I've been thinking about a lot. I have one of my daughters is vegan and very environmentally active, and she's really focused my attention a lot over the last couple of years on access to good food, quality food. Um, I have the luxury where I live of shopping at an organic food store, and I can get fresh produce, and I don't worry about chemicals and pesticides and things like that. But a lot of people don't have access to good quality food. Um, and this is something that predates the coronavirus,
Mm-hmm.
situation that we find ourselves in. People I know in many urban centers don't have access to quality food, and that has tremendous health consequences if people. To the extent diet, for instance, is related to chronic illnesses like diabetes and heart disease. But to relate that to what's on the front pages right now, today, this morning, I was reading. There was a chart of the different communities across the country and how and when people started responding to calls for staying inside and limiting the extent to which
Mm.
you go outside. And what you see on this map is really throughout the South, in particular, not exclusively in the South, but a lot of communities in the South have really come very late to this idea of not venturing far from home, which of course implicates significantly risks for spreading, this contagious virus. Some of that may be, coming very late to the game in terms of
Mm-hmm.
leadership. You and I were talking before we started recording. The governor of Georgia, for example, just this morning saying he didn't realize until yesterday. We're recording this on Thursday, April 2nd. He didn't realize until yesterday, maybe this was a bad April Fool's joke, that
Yeah.
asymptomatic individuals can be contagious and can infect others with this coronavirus. I mean, I don't know how that's something the governor of a big state like Georgia only learned yesterday. But you see where I'm going with this is, yeah, rural people in rural communities, people in some ways in urban communities, contrary to what you might think, having less access to quality food. How much of an issue is that, do you think, or how much a part of the issue is that, do you think, at least in our country? And how does that become even more intense a problem during a pandemic crisis like we're in the middle of now?
Right. Yeah. I mean, food it has become more and more, I think, a question of wealth in America, and and to me, this coronavirus just really heightens that. If you have money, you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
You can weather. I know all of our 401ks have tanked,
Yeah. Yeah.
but still, when you have relative wealth, you can survive quite a ways, and like I feel incredibly lucky. I've got two teenagers, and my spouse works with Vermont Judiciary. We live in Hanover, New Hampshire. We're hooked up with colleges. Actually, none of the students are here, so it's not a ghost town, but there's a lot fewer people. But we've got a great, like you said, we've got a great access to organic food, and local food is big up here. So we're super lucky, and I
Mm-hmm.
feel very lucky to have access to food. When these kind of crises hit, you realize what's really important. Your health, your family, being able to access food. We actually had hand sanitizer because we used to travel back in the day, like, just months ago, and we have teenagers, so we had hand
Right.
sanitizer. So we were able to actually go and sanitize our hands and feel relatively safe when we went out shopping. And we're not wealthy but we are doing fine because we
Yeah.
do have resources. But for people who don't, and that's increasingly more Americans now just in the last month, you know, this is enormous issue. It really exacerbates, the lack of access to healthy and nutritious foods that existed previously. And to bootstrap into a comment that you made, or emphasize a comment you made just a minute ago about the long-term consequences of not having access to healthy food, it's that it's if you start your life that way, there's a spiraling consequence, right? It's your performance in school. It's
Mm.
then that turns into the kinds of jobs you get, and then the long term health consequences. Like I think I've read studies that say if you're obese when you're younger, you're more likely to be obese when you're older. And then of course, all the obesity related diseases like diabetes or heart disease, things that will shorten your life, and make your life less enjoyable and really constrain kind of your options. So it's one of those basic things that's so important to have a happy and kind of long and well lived life. And this epidemic this pandemic, I think once again is really throwing a real spotlight on this issue, and I hope it does. Really, I hope we learn many things from this crisis. One of them is how to think more long term in terms of our governance, especially when we know that unfortunately bad things are going to happen. We are going to have pandemics. We are going to have antibiotic resistance to bacteria. Another thing you and I were talking about before this.
Mm-hmm.
We are in a climate change environment, which is changing our ability to do things, and it will and does disrupt supply chains. And actually, all this stuff is really caused by humans. I mean, we did this, and if we do this, we should have the ingenuity to govern better so that we can address some of the ways that we've interacted with nature that is essentially backfiring on us, right? I mean, all these things we can really trace back to our interaction with nature and
Mm-hmm.
and the way we've really pushed the bounds of our biosphere, essentially.
Well,
Not to get
and
random.
another another issue with regard to food security and access to food. I mean, many of us have experienced shelves being emptied out at the supermarkets and things like that, which we live in the wealthiest country in the world, so we're shocked when something like that happens. But I actually think more shocking is what you see. You brought up children. Uh, it's one thing to say, okay, shut down all the schools. We have to do that to protect the lives of our children and our teachers in those schools. But so many children in America depend on meals they get from school. So shutting down a school means shutting down their access to those meals. And this, I mean, that's a big issue, isn't it, for a lot of people
Oh,
going through this pandemic right now?
it's stunning. It's stunning. You're absolutely right. And in fact, the school system here, they're continuing to make food lunches, and they're delivering them to those families, which I think is absolutely the right thing to do. You mentioning that too brought up an anecdote to me that happened before the coronavirus. It was around the holidays. I was talking to police officers, but both our kids were. It was before the holidays, but both our kids play field hockey, or girls, and he is the police officer in a rural town in Vermont. He's pretty much it. He is the police in that
He's the
particular
law.
town. He's the
Yeah.
law, right?
Yeah.
And he tries to do community policing, which he really enjoys, and so he would go to the local elementary school, and he, periodically and give talks and talk about public health and safety and things like that, and he overheard a conversation between some of the people who worked in the cafeteria and the principal, and concerns that there were some of the children going through, I think it was like a before Thanksgiving break, going through several times, and they were concerned about being able to feed all the students. And the principal said, we're just going to make it work. We're going to find a way to get more food. And her concern was that these kids were going through several times, not because they were hoarding, but because they knew that when they went on break, they weren't going to be eating much. So they
Mm.
were packing on the calories as much as they could, getting the last good meal before they were going on break. So
Yeah.
that's not, that's the reality for quite a few Americans. I mean, we're not talking a handful of folks. We're talking about a real problem in our country, which is actually why those benefits that the USDA supplements and pays for women's and children, and the supplemental nutrition assistance program that's funded through the Farm Bill. That's why those programs are critical. And we really see that, today, just how critical they are. And in fact, Congress had to pass more money because there'll be many more people that are seeking SNAP benefits, and they'll be eligible for them because they will be, below the poverty line.
Yeah. Well, all right. So let me ask what is, I know, a huge question, and we'll just see where we go with it. But
Or,
we talked so far about a huge wealth gap in the country, which is no surprise or news to anybody, but how that, uh, what the implications are that in terms of access to food, and not just any food, but good food. And you've also raised a few times now the interrelationship between food security and climate change. I mean, I've watched a lot of documentaries on this, again because I have a daughter who's doing the good work of educating me, and because I care about this a lot. We all have to care about this. Um, your focus on sustainable agriculture. I mean, we're a country of 350 million people or more. There are many fine, sustainable, all organic, food producers, farms in this country. But I mean, they can't really produce enough to feed the entire population. You have to have industrial agriculture with all its evils, or can you have industrial agriculture with fewer evils, let's say? I mean, how do you deal with the issue of producing enough food? Or is it, as some people say, we've got plenty of food, that's not our problem, the issue is getting it to people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just wrapped up a lot of different issues and controversies and
I
one
told you it
long
was a big
statement.
question.
It's a rich one. I've got colleagues who we debate this all the time. I'm more on the moderate side. I've got, and I used to have students actually who thought it was agroecology now. We can feed the world so much more effectively if we had these super diversified farms and on 10 acres or whatever. And I don't mean to make fun of that. I guess I'm kind of sounding that way. But I would look at them and I say, really, you want to be a farmer? I mean, like, we have a highly urbanized population because most people don't want to be farmers, right? Although we do need farmers, and we're losing them. We're getting a lot older in this country over time, and so how do you encourage a new generation of farmers? And that's one of our issues right now when it comes to sustaining agriculture and having sustainable agriculture. So on the spectrum, though, of agroecology now, I'd say, and then we have to have intensive conventional agriculture. That's the way to go. On the other side, I'm in the middle. I think that we need all different kind of levels of agriculture production, whether they're hyper local and small and diversified, to really having more robust middle-sized and slightly diversified farms, which we don't have many of in this country. Actually, we have a growing number of small farms, high increasing numbers of consolidated farms with higher acreage on one, and we have very few in the middle, which is unfortunate. And usually that's because the economies of scale. But so I believe we need to kind of have all kinds, but I definitely believe that conventional agriculture can be and must be more sustainable. That it's not, and in fact, although I think the people's interest in food and the so-called food movement has really encouraged a broader engagement on these issues, which I think is a really positive development. And I think, businesses like supply chains, major companies are really looking at how they can work with producers to be more sustainable, to use less fertilizer, to think about soil health and water quality. For example, the Walton Family Foundation, which is
for Walmart,
Walmart, right? They're the biggest funder, I think, of sustainable ag research and initiatives in the Mississippi basin in order to make agriculture more sustainable.
When you say people are more engaged, do you mean more people are more aware of caring about where their food comes from, asking questions about that, and in that way creating a demand among food producers to provide that kind of information?
Absolutely, and even more than that too, like the awareness of industrial animal agriculture and people who care about animal welfare. People who, I think, especially millennials. I think for those of us who are slightly older, we tend to think of environmental law and the environmental movement as separate, but I think that maybe millennials, because they didn't grow up during the 70s and 80s when really we were, I think, at the kind of, in some ways, at the golden age of our environmental law, federal infrastructure. They don't see those lines, which I think is a really good thing. So I think there's just a general appreciation and a growth in terms of, and a willingness to pay. Millennials, you may have seen the marketing data. Millennials are willing to pay more
Mm-hmm.
for food that they think is healthier. And just I think you and I are probably around the same vintage, roughly, right? And when I was growing up, there
Are
was
you
no such.
asking me how old I am?
No, I would never do that because I know we're
It's
both
okay.
eternally
I'm
youthful. But
57.
but
It's
I'm just remembering when I was growing up, there was no such thing as like celebrity chefs. I mean,
yeah.
or there were food co-ops, but they tended to be crunchy granola, kind of fringy things that the 60s hippies started. It was organics was not mainstream. There wasn't a robust food culture in America, except for those back to the landers in the 60s. But now
Yeah.
it's actually more broad based. So my concern as both an educator and advocate, and just a practical person who's interested in governance and the law and progressing it, is that I don't want to see this as a fad, as although I do believe things caves, right? What's new was old, and what's old is new again. That whole thing. What I want to see is some of this movement really translate into legal and policy frameworks that really embed these principles and these values in our society.
Well, that's a good segue to what I was just thinking about to ask you next. and and just for the record, I mean, I grew up the son of two sort of pre-hippie hippies from Berkeley, California, and
Mm.
I was raised on grape nuts, which only means that when I got to college, I couldn't wait to buy a big box of Captain Crunch.
Right.
Um,
You and me both.
but uh, as and I wonder, and maybe at some point you can also recommend to people some because there are some really great documentaries that people can watch. I mean, I remember Food Inc. There's another one called Cowspiracy. I learned a lot by watching those, and so to sort of zoom out from this issue now a bit and think about, well, what are the things as a matter of policy that we ought to be doing differently? Because not that it's easy, but it's easier to identify the problems than to really get to figuring out what are some of the solutions that would work. But I remember, in particular, not to try to tell the whole history of agriculture in our country, but certainly today, as you pointed out, we have large farms that that maybe once upon a time had a diversity of crops, and now it's basically corn and soy.
Mm-hmm.
And our government does subsidize farmers in the growing of corn and soy, and of course, corn is not only used to raise ears of corn, but to raise food for livestock, and also to create all the sugary corn
Corn syrup.
substances, and corn syrup
Yep.
and fructose and all the stuff that goes into every sweet thing that is on our supermarket shelves, which is
Right.
just about everything. I mean,
Yeah.
should we be subsidizing those things? Is that one of the things that we should be focused on? I never understood why we do that especially when you listen to conservatives talking about a free market economy, when it comes to subsidizing big farmers so that they continue to grow corn and soy, that doesn't seem very free market. It seems to have a lot of downstream,
Impact. Yep.
impacts in terms of not only food but health.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I do think we should subsidize agriculture in America because just not the way that we're doing it.
Mm.
And I would say, it's interesting because we don't have time to get into the history of agriculture in America, but I do want to make the point that the reason why we have huge monocrops, why we support corn especially, and we have over the years, is because that those were intentional policies. So it's not that farmers are evil or the government's evil, but we had these policies that, and I think they're kind of rooted in some respects into this idea that we can make agriculture more efficient. That can be a machine. It's that whole, post World War II modernism kind of movement, and and that bigger is better, and you can be more efficient. And certainly there are some efficiencies of scale, but one of the things I think that's most problematic about a lot of our agriculture in America is that we don't take into account the externalities. So the nutrient runoff. Agriculture is a leading source of water pollution in this country, and it's why we have the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. It's
Yeah.
why the Chesapeake Bay is although it's improving, but it's still really has serious issues. It's why Lake Champlain near me has nutrient and dangerous algal blooms. So
But
we don't.
that's from industrial animal agriculture mostly, isn't it?
Well, in Vermont, though, it's not. It's not. Our farms tend to be smaller, so it's runoff. It's runoff from dairies and some row crop agriculture. But because the way we do production, and we haven't, we go right up to the stream, or we don't really have buffers, or we don't have as much diversity as we should have. When you remove the diversity of production, you actually undercut resilience. I mean, Mother Nature's brilliant, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have all this diversity in part because it makes nature more resilient. When you strip that out and you drain the wetlands, and when you take out the vegetation and you put in monocrops, you essentially leave the landscape vulnerable to things like extreme weather, which we're having, and pests and things like that, which we're having more of now because of climate change. So it's actually kind of a recipe for disaster in the long term. But we're seeing that already, like just last year with the Midwest floods. I don't know if you remember
Yeah.
that.
Sure.
It's unbelievable. And so that's not a thing that's just going to pass. Even I think a lot of farmers in the Midwest understand that, the weather it's changing in their lifetime very quickly. So all this is, so we've said all the things that are wrong, right? To go back to your comment
Yeah.
before, and I'm a big believer in having a recipe for change and a recipe to address these social issues. So one of the things I think we can do and we should do is we should look at, if not the Farm Bill, then something new. But certainly I think the Farm Bill would really benefit from a new framework that really focuses on providing for food security and resilient communities. And it doesn't do that. In fact, I don't even think you can probably do a word search of the Farm Bill, and if climate change was mentioned once, I'd be surprised. It's not intended to, and it does not provide for food security or planning to ensure robust agriculture operations in a time of climate change. It's not intended to do that, and it doesn't do that. And because of that, it's a wasted opportunity to address these issues. So,
well, take a step back, Laurie. So, what is
sure,
the Farm Bill, and
sure.
how is what does it do, and what do you think it ought to do better that it's not doing now?
Yeah, so the Farm Bill is an omnibus piece of legislation, which for our non-lawyers who are listening to this, is essentially it's a bunch of different laws that are passed together. And it is passed every 4 or 5 years. The last one was passed on time, so in 2018, December 2018. And it provides actually a host of policies and funding for everything from rural development to crop insurance, which is our major safety net now for farmers, to nutrition, like we were just talking about, the food security aspect. And it used to be called food stamps, but it's now called
Mm-hmm.
Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, so SNAP. People might have
Mm-hmm.
heard of the term SNAP before. In fact, that is the largest portion of the Farm Bill, about 76%.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And people see that number like, why are we spending so much on SNAP? But really, it doesn't break down to be that much per person or per family. And so, in fact, that's become the SNAP portion of the Farm Bill has become kind of the lightning rod for debate. The last Farm Bill process, the House, which at the time was controlled by the Republicans, wanted to cut billions from SNAP, so leaving really our most vulnerable Americans without enough food. So, and the Senate clawed that back, which was good. But and I guess it's kind of a tangent, but it's related. And I think it's important to say this, especially given what's happening with the coronavirus right now. to me, it's unthinkable, it's unconscionable that we would debate cutting, uh, just a safety net of food to Americans in need. It's cynical and it's also destructive. And it's just wrong. It's morally wrong. So why are we still having that debate in this country? And I wonder, we've gone back and forth on this. Do we keep SNAP as part of the Farm Bill in the old, not the old days, but just a couple of decades ago, the reason why it was still included in the Farm Bill was because it was thought that the urban Congress people would, who wanted SNAP, would be able to get it through easier by supporting rural Congresspersons' interests
Yeah,
in
in the farming.
farming, right?
Yeah.
But that hasn't. Now we actually see that it's up for debate in a really cynical way. So I'm not so sure that logic still holds. And I do think, and I'm really hoping that one of the good things, if we can say that, from the pandemic will be people really thinking about, how are we going to take care of each other? What are the best legislative vehicles for doing so? Maybe it's still the Farm Bill, but what I'd really like to see is us not have a debate about cutting it seriously, but saying, okay, how can we make it better? How can we ensure that we have an appropriate and robust safety net, given the things that can happen to people's individual lives, but the things that can happen to us as a country?
Well, and you brought up climate change in the Farm Bill, Laurie, and I'm wondering, one of the things that I'm worrying about is that the pandemic is forcing us all to really think almost about daily survival now, and that's everything from people worrying about getting sick and ending up in a hospital and on a ventilator, and pray for all the people who are sick and right now, and all the people trying to save their lives, to the ridiculous runs on toilet paper in the supermarket. I mean,
Yeah.
people, level of panic. But we're all so focused on what is right in front of us. I have to get through this day. I have to get through this week. Will my business survive till next week? Till has that taken some focus away from the issue of climate change, which it seemed like we were starting to focus on as a country in a way we hadn't yet. Because we're now so focused on the immediate, have we taken our eye off of the issues that we really still need to be thinking about and planning for, that may be 5, 10, 20 years away from us, when it comes to food? I mean, if there isn't enough food, where are we going to be as a species, let alone as a country? How do you see that playing into what we need to continue to focus on right now?
Such a great question. Well, first of all, immediate needs are immediate needs. I mean,
Yeah, right.
who can blame people?
Well, of
And I do,
course.
yeah. So I think that people should be taking care of themselves, and but in a way that doesn't hurt their neighbor. I've seen a lot of grace during this time period, and I've seen some things that the worst of people comes out, but then the best of people.
So true.
I try to hold on to what I see as the best of people, right, during these times. So yeah, I think immediate needs for sure are just going to be front and center, but I do think that we still need to continue our good work. And like for me, my focus is on climate change and long-term sustainability and rural resilience. So I'm actually still doing that. I have consultancy, so I was working from home before. I'm super lucky. I'm still working on the same stuff I was working on before.
Hmm.
I'm very lucky. But I would encourage those with money, those foundations and government just to run to continue to focus on that longer term planning, that we don't lose some ground. So we do need to continue those good works, but knowing that we also, because we didn't plan very well at all for a pandemic, if at all, it's looking like not much at all, right? In fact, I think the Trump administration actually dismantled some of the things that the Obama administration put into place. Um, you know, that is the first order of the day is, I think, getting that infrastructure together and learning from this whole ordeal, essentially. But I do think continuing good work as we are able to do so, and those of us like me, and it seems like you, although you have a business yourself and you're responsible for people, which I'm sure weighs on your mind, that we do what we can, and we don't stop doing what we can because these things are so important for our long term health and well being.
Right. And I mean, I certainly didn't mean to suggest that people should take their eye off of the
Oh
immediate
no, I know.
in front of
Yeah,
us at all. But we
no,
are
but
going to come through this. We're going to come out of this, and we're going to reemerge into the world, into the outside world again. And I think it's useful to highlight some of the ways in which this crisis that we're in the midst of still um, brings to the surface and brings to the forefront of our thinking things that we then have to really work hard to plan for and prepare for, and maybe think about changing structurally, so that we don't have some of the things that we're dealing with now. We're talking about food and climate and the environment. So as we come out of this, which we will, what then do you think are the what, as a former policy person, as a someone thinking deeply about these things in your work now, what do you think are some of the big issues that we will want to be thinking about in terms of food security as we emerge from this pandemic we're dealing with?
sure. And that this whole thread of conversation is super important, and it reminds me of, because I was actually in D.C. when 9/11 happened. I was pregnant with my first child, and I was actually working on the mall. And this reminds me a little bit of that, although it's a longer term thing for sure. Although
Mm-hmm.
for the people who were directly involved with 9/11, it's still ongoing, I'm sure, for them. But in some ways. But what I remember about that time was that life, business as usual stopped, and it was almost surreal,
Yeah.
honestly. And this time feels a little surreal. But what happened out of that time, both good and bad, was that we did get a lot of legislative movement. I mean, we had the Department of Homeland Security
Yep. Yep.
you remember, yeah, it was
Yes.
put together. It was consolidated a bunch of different agencies, and then the TSA, which we never had TSA before, right? For like 20-year-olds now, like they have no concept that's a new thing,
Right. Right.
things happen because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that experience can inform this one, and when we look back on this, and it's an opportunity. These crises actually open up. It creates actually legislative movement sometimes, and so
Mm-hmm.
you can actually leverage that harm as a positive in terms of, okay, what do we do moving forward? And one of the I'm not a public health specialist, but it does seem to me, and I've heard this critique, that devolving to states and localities for public health messaging and public health strategy plans in total is not a great idea, and it's not very efficient or effective or just when you have a pandemic.
Yeah.
So strengthening our public health from a national perspective, I think that's job number one.
Right.
And that should take into consideration things like basic food security, uh, access to clean water, which is a problem in our country, unbelievably, but it is. Um, and actually even access to telecommunications. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
all those things that you need when you have to shelter in place, or when you can't get places, or you shouldn't go anywhere, right? So what do we need in this country in order to be healthy when these things happen? And I think we talked about this a little bit before we started chatting for the podcast, but Governor Cuomo is, in my opinion, has been doing a fantastic job. I mean, this is the shining moment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't live in New York State, but I'm checking in with him when he does his press conferences, because he's got a lot of great information, and he's telling it like it is. He's talking about the fact that he's having to bid with other governors for ventilators, and potentially bidding up the price of ventilators.
Yeah.
I mean, if we had a
And
national,
against the federal government, the states are competing against
yeah,
the federal government.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, you're essentially gambling away people's lives, and
Yeah.
it's pitting people against people at a time when you don't want to do that. It's a time for the nation to come together. There should be a centralized and nimble response, and there should be clear information coming out and accessible and real support for state and local authorities in a consistent way. Instead, what we have here, and I think this is like a brilliant example, we have people from New York or Connecticut trying to come to rural areas. I was just listening to VPR, that's Vermont Public Radio, where the governor of Vermont's like, we really don't want you to come. It's not to be mean, but it's just that when you have people who they're essentially the vector of the illness and they're spreading it,
Yeah. Yeah.
because of their own self-interest. I can't blame them, but but here we are having different governors who are on the ball trying to stop the spread nationally, where we really should have some more direction nationally. So it's too ad hoc, and when you have so many lives on the line, it's criminal, really. Honestly, I'll just say it. I think it's criminal.
Yeah, it is. And for something like this, yeah, we have been really lacking a coherent national response, and it always bugs me when I hear stories about people working in the administration on the messaging. I mean, that sounds like PR. I mean, forget about
Yeah.
messaging. How about policy? How about leadership and coordination? And I think that's why someone like uh, Governor Cuomo comes across so positively, is because he seems to have the executive leadership that he's communicating and acting on, while also communicating a lot of empathy for what people are dealing with.
Exactly. Yeah, he's threading
And
that needle.
yeah, threading that needle. And uh, I think I think we're wrapping up, but I'm going to throw one more giant topic onto the table as I have to. Knowing that there's no way that we can really do it justice. But again, I'll come as we wrap up. I'll ask you maybe to suggest some resources people can go to get some more information. But because we're talking about climate change and the environment and how it relates to agriculture policy and food security, and one of the most basic needs that people have, which is to have enough food for their families and their children. Um, there is another. There is the world at large. I mean, we're focusing so far in our conversation about the United States, our country, but if we're paying attention to the impact of climate change on the planet, there are parts of the world that are going to experience major changes in their climate that's going to affect their ability to to grow food. I mean, there are big parts of Africa, there are parts of Asia, and so on. There are rainforests being cut down in South America. How I'm wondering, maybe to strike a positive note, I'm hoping, fingers crossed here. In some ways, it seems like one of the things that's coming out of this coronavirus pandemic is a certain amount of international cooperation among the scientific community, at least among the public health community, both in terms of sharing information, learning from the experience in other countries, collaborating on working on vaccines and tests and so forth. Yeah, there are stories of competition as well. And some of the rhetoric out of Washington is still very, USA first. But do you see perhaps coming out of this uh, a greater focus on ways in which, as a country, we can cooperate and collaborate with other countries around the world on this issue? Because we're not an island here in the United States. We may act as if we are, like when we withdraw from the Paris Climate Change Accord and other things that we do. but we're not an island. We can't function as an island in the world. Do
Right.
you see any hope for us working more closely with governments in other countries, with international organizations, NGOs, on the issue of climate change, perhaps as one of those things that we learn the lesson of coming out of this experience?
With the next administration, hopefully, I think that will happen. but
Yeah, yeah.
but I do think, though, that from the public health perspective, that's been glaringly clear that we had some warning. That's the other thing. The United States had warning when it became clear what was happening in China, but we didn't take that warning as seriously as we should have. But I do think that having a more robust international response, having America really step back into its shoes as the global leader, not having the United States in that role, both in terms of climate change and global health and things like that, I think has really undermined kind of progress in the recent past. But to me, one of the positives that's coming out of that is it just goes to show you how important we are. Not to say that America's everything, and it's important to have humility. But when you're the largest economy in the world, you do have a great role to play, and I think a
Hmm.
great responsibility, and and the role in maintaining or helping having a global peace. So. And I hope that we learned that from looking back at the last 4 years too. Is our role that we cannot shrink from our
Hmm.
global role as leaders. And to get back to your point though about the global food security, it was really interesting during the Obama administration. The Department of Defense, I think it was during the Obama administration, or maybe it was even the Bush administration. It might have been Bush. The Department of Defense came out with a report that said that essentially that climate change was a risk, national security risk to the United
Yeah.
States. And yeah, and they did. They actually included in it about food security, essentially, and that for those countries, especially those less developed countries that are graduating millions of people into the middle class, who will want those more expensive food things like meat, protein, as we
Hmm.
do,
Hmm.
understandably, will put a great strain on existing food resources in those countries. And like you said, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about Southeast Asia, we're talking about swaths of South America. And incidentally, those places are the places that will probably lose the most in terms of yield because of reductions in precipitation.
Hmm.
So we know from models that's actually happening now that we're going to need a great deal more food calories. That the demand for those food calories are going to happen in the places that populations are growing, and that's not here. But all that will impact the U.S. So we are our boat is our train is hitched to the rest of the world,
Yeah.
whether or not we like it. And but I think from the human standpoint, from the global stability standpoint, that we need to actively engage. It's it's just the reality of it,
Yeah.
and this pandemic is just another example of that. It's just more immediate, and people can see it. It's really affecting people, whereas climate change has been more subtle. Although I think it's rapidly increasing, even more faster than some scientists had thought. So I do see a silver lining in this. I am an optimist. I believe that through good policy, through doing things like reforming the Farm Bill, having an actual purpose statement that really does put sustainability and long-term productivity front and center, as well as providing good food for Americans and really for the food that we export. We can do that. We can make our laws embrace the post-climate world we're in instead of being stuck in the 20th century. We can still be innovative in governance and policy in America, and we really need to do so. And I think the pandemic is just really illustrates that in a very pointed and poignant way.
Well, Laurie, there's a lot of food for thought here, and I know that's a terrible joke. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry. I
You're
teased this a
forgiven.
couple of times. Where do you have some recommendations for where people can go to get some further information on this? I know that you have written on the subject, and you have some links on your bio. I don't know. What do you recommend for people? Because if people are paying attention, they're going to have a lot more questions about all this, I'm sure.
Sure. There's some good media outlets these days that are covering. I mean, Civil Eats is something people can Google, and they've got some good stories about what's happening in our food system. The New Food Economy has done some interesting pieces. I always, I think The Omnivore's Dilemma is a great place to start. Michael
Yeah,
Pollan
great book.
yeah, it's kind of a classic, really. Um, uh, you know, yeah, and even mainstream New York Times has done some great stuff about food and the Farm Bill. My stuff tends to be wonky, but if anybody is listening to this who's a researcher or whatever, I posted things about the Farm Bill and ways to make it better. Also a scholar, and I'm on the board of trustees for the Center for Progressive Reform, and you can find some of my stuff there. And you'd mentioned some really interesting documentaries like
Yeah.
Food Inc., Cowspiracy. I think are helpful to watch. They'll give folks, I think, a good thumbnail or of at least some people's opinion on what's happening with the food system.
Terrific. Well, Laurie Ristino from Vermont, from the Vermont Law School, and
previously, yeah, but not now.
Not now, but
right.
With where are you teaching now? Is it Johns Hopkins?
Yeah, Johns Hopkins. I teach environmental policy, and I'm also a consultant at my own firm called Strategies for a Sustainable Future, and you can actually Google that too. I've got a website.
We'll put a link to that in the description for the episode too, Laurie, so people can get to it easily.
That'd be awesome.
What I would say disturbing and important and illuminating conversation. Lots to think about, lots more to learn about, lots of lessons of all kinds coming out of the crisis we're living through at this time that I think we'll be talking about for a lot of years to come. So, Laurie Ristino, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. It was such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and stay healthy.
You too.